You're homeless now. My dad's laughter echoed through the grand foyer of the mansion I had spent 5 years maintaining. He wasn't joking. He stood there alongside my golden child stepbrother, throwing my bags onto the wet driveway. They thought they had perfectly executed a plan to strip me of my inheritance, my home and my dignity, leaving me with absolutely nothing. Everyone in our elite social circle thought I was completely broken as I quietly walked away without shedding a single tear. What my dad didn't know, what his arrogant laughter completely drowned out, was that I had spent the last 6 months quietly documenting every single offshore account, forged signature and fraudulent wire transfer they used to build their fake empire. They thought they were throwing away an unprotected daughter. In reality, they were opening the front door for the federal investigators already waiting around the corner. Follow my story to the end to see how the trap snapped shut. My name is Emily, and at 27 years old, I always believed that hard work and loyalty to your family actually meant something. But as I stood on the cold, rain-slicked concrete of the driveway, watching my life's work get casually tossed into the mud, that illusion completely shattered. The heavy front doors of the estate swung open again, and my father walked out onto the porch, flanked by my stepbrother, Julian. They weren't just taking away my job at the family real estate empire. They were taking away my home, my peace of mind, and my dignity. You're homeless now. My dad's booming laughter echoed through the grand stone arches of the mansion. The sound was deafening, dripping with a strange, vindictive joy that made my stomach churn. Julian stood right beside him, a smug, practiced grin plastered across his face as he kicked my final duffel bag down the steps. To anyone passing by, it looked like a devastating defeat. It looked like a young woman who had just lost everything she had spent the last 5 years of her life building. For half a decade, I was the one who woke up at 5 in the morning to review corporate contracts, manage tenant disputes, and keep our property portfolios profitable. Meanwhile, Julian was given a vice president title just for showing up to occasional lunches. But they had orchestrated a quiet, malicious corporate coup behind my back, using forged documents to strip me of my shares and my legal rights to the estate. They genuinely believed they had outsmarted me. They thought that by throwing me out onto the street with nothing but a few bags of clothes, they were erasing me from the family legacy completely. As my dad continued to laugh, adjusting his expensive watch and looking down at me like I was a piece of trash he'd finally discarded, I didn't cry. I didn't beg and I didn't scream. I just quietly picked up my bags, threw them into the trunk of my modest sedan, and looked back at the two men standing on the porch. My father's arrogant laughter completely drowned out the quiet hum of my car engine, but it also drowned out his own common sense. What he and Julian didn't know, what their massive egos prevented them from seeing, was that I wasn't leaving empty-handed. My phone was already vibrating in my pocket with a confirmation text from a contact I had made months ago. They thought they were throwing away a helpless daughter, but in reality, they were just clearing the driveway for the federal investigators who were already pulling up around the corner. To understand how I ended up on that wet driveway, you have to understand the dynamic that ruled our household for as long as I could remember. My mother passed away when I was just a child, leaving me alone with a father who viewed everything in life through the lens of transaction, power, and leverage. When he remarried a few years later, he brought my stepmother and her son Julian into our lives. From the very beginning, it was glaringly obvious that the rules were entirely different for the two of us. Julian was the golden child who could absolutely do no wrong, while I was the live-in assistant who had to constantly earn her right to exist under my father's roof. As we grew up, that divide only deepened into a canyon. Julian was handed an Ivy League education on a silver platter, though he spent more time partying than studying, while I fought tooth and nail for every single academic achievement. When we both entered the family real estate business, the favoritism became a corporate policy. Julian was immediately given a corner office, a corporate credit card, and a vice president title, despite the fact that he barely understood how a basic commercial lease worked. I, on the other hand, was placed in the trenches. I was the one analyzing the market trends, dealing with angry investors and pulling 90-hour work weeks just to keep our profit margins afloat. My dad always told me it was character building. He'd look me dead in the eye and say, "Emily, you need to prove you have what it takes to protect this family legacy." Foolishly, I believed him. I thought that if I just worked a little harder, closed a few more multi-million-dollar deals, and kept the company running flawlessly, he would finally see me as a peer. I thought he would respect me. But the truth was far uglier. My dad and Julian didn't want a partner, they wanted a shield. They wanted someone competent enough to handle the actual work, but disposable enough to blame if things ever went sideways. Julian's lifestyle was incredibly expensive, and his vague consulting projects were draining company cash fast. As the years went on, I started noticing that my father was becoming increasingly desperate to fund Julian's endless failures, and that desperation was driving them toward some very dark corners. The turning point arrived 6 months before the eviction, during a routine upgrade of our company's legacy digital ledgers. Because my father and Julian viewed me as the resident workhorse, they dumped the entire transition project onto my desk, completely unaware that it gave me deep, unfettered access to our historical financial archives. As I mapped out the data migration, I began noticing strange, recurring anomalies in our commercial real estate portfolios. Massive sums of money were moving through obscure holding companies before vanishing entirely into offshore accounts, completely bypassed by our standard accounting software. The deeper I dug into the digital archives, the more the terrifying truth began to crystallize. My father and Julian weren't just mismanaging funds to keep up appearances. They were running a highly sophisticated tax evasion and investment fraud scheme. They had been heavily inflating the values of our properties to secure massive loans from investors, then filtering that cash through shell corporations to fund Julian's lifestyle. It was an absolute house of cards, built entirely on forged signatures, falsified property appraisals, and fraudulent wire transfers. Sitting alone in the empty office late at night, staring at the glowing monitor, a cold chill settled deep in my bones. I realized right then that my father had never intended to pass the legacy down to me. He and Julian were setting up a perfect corporate trap, intentionally structuring the business operations so that my name was attached to the day-to-day management documents, while their names remained shielded behind the offshore entities. Or rather, when the entire empire collapsed under the weight of its own deception, I was the one lined up to take the fall. I would be the scapegoat left holding the bag for millions of dollars in fraudulent debts, while they walked away clean. That night, looking at the irrefutable evidence spanning years of greed, I knew I had to make a choice. Let them destroy me or start fighting back in secret. Knowing the storm that was brewing, I realized my only option was to play the part of the submissive, oblivious daughter perfectly. If my father or Julian suspected even for a single second that I was onto them, they would have locked me out of the system immediately and accelerated their plans to ruin me. So every morning I put on a mask. I walked into the office with a smile, sat at my desk, and listened to Julian brag about his weekend trips while I silently managed the crushing workload they kept dumping on my plate. I became the ultimate yes woman, agreeing with their short-sighted business ideas and letting them think they had complete control over me. Behind the scenes, however, every spare minute was a covert operation. While they believed I was merely compiling standard quarterly reports, I was actually copying full hard drives and building a comprehensive digital archive of their entire fraudulent system. The tension during our regular family dinners was almost unbearable. I would sit across from my father as he toasted to our bright family future, nodding along politely while my mind raced with the encrypted file structures I had duplicated earlier that afternoon. I had to ensure that every single document, every email exchange, and every offshore wire transfer was backed up in multiple secure locations outside the company network. It was a dangerous game of cat and mouse. There were moments when Julian would walk into my office unexpectedly, his eyes scanning my desk suspiciously, and my heart would hammer against my ribs as I quickly minimized the forensic accounting spreadsheets on my screen. I had to force my voice to remain calm, asking him about his latest expensive hobby just to distract him. They truly believed I lacked the business acumen to decipher their complex web of shell companies. They viewed me as nothing more than an obedient tool to be used and discarded, completely unaware that while they were planning my downfall, I was meticulously gathering the exact ammunition required to tear their fake empire down to the ground. Gathering the evidence was only the first step. I needed to know exactly how to weaponize it without leaving my own fingerprints on the blast radius. A month after discovering the offshore ledgers, I arranged a secret consultation with a top-tier forensic accountant and a veteran legal advisor who specialized in corporate crime. We met in a quiet, unassuming diner on the outskirts of the city, far away from the upscale neighborhoods where my father's business partners operated. I slid an encrypted flash drive across the table, my hands trembling slightly as the gravity of what I was doing finally caught up to me. For 3 hours, They meticulously reviewed the financial footprints I had pulled from our company archives. The forensic accountant's expression grew progressively darker with every spreadsheet he scrolled through. When he finally looked up, his voice was hushed but intense. He explained that my father and Julian hadn't just committed simple tax evasion. They had crossed major legal boundaries by moving fraudulent funds across state lines and involving international banking institutions. This wasn't a standard, messy family dispute that could be resolved in a local probate court. It was a massive, multi-layered corporate conspiracy that fell squarely into the jurisdiction of federal law enforcement agencies. My legal advisor leaned in close, looking at me with a mixture of pity and deep professional respect. He warned me that if I simply tried to confront them or sue them privately, their high-priced corporate lawyers would easily twist the narrative, utilizing the paperwork they'd forced me to sign to make me look like the guilty party. The only way to survive this with my freedom and my future intact was to hand the entire roadmap over to the federal authorities. I had to let the government build an airtight case from the shadows while I continued to act as the perfect, unsuspecting target inside the office. It was a terrifying realization, but as I left that diner, I knew there was no turning back. To ensure my father and Julian walked directly into their own trap, I knew I had to give them the perfect opportunity to strike. During the weekly operations review, I intentionally left a glaring manufactured vulnerability in our property management reports, a supposed oversight in our debt-to-equity ratios that made it look like I had severely miscalculated a major commercial refinancing deal. It was a calculated risk, a digital breadcrumb designed to see if their greed would override their caution. My father took the bait almost instantly. I watched from across the conference table as his eyes narrowed, staring at the deliberate error before he slid the folder over to Julian with a knowing nod. They didn't point out the mistake to correct me. Instead, they immediately began framing the narrative around my supposed incompetence. Over the next few days, they quietly shifted a massive block of bad corporate debt directly onto the subsidiary company I managed, intending to use this specific flaw as the ultimate proof that I was the one responsible for the business's financial bleeding. The tension in the office grew palpable as I watched them execute their countermove, completely unaware that every single internal memo, altered contract, and hurried meeting they held to secure my downfall was being logged by the forensic tracking software I had installed. They were working overtime to build a bulletproof case to present to our board of directors and legal team, fully believing they were successfully outmaneuvering their quiet, submissive daughter. In reality, every piece of paperwork they altered to shift the blame onto my shoulders was just adding another ironclad layer of evidence to the federal profile, proving their direct intent to defraud both the investors and me. The morning of the final corporate meeting arrived, and the atmosphere inside the main boardroom was suffocatingly tense. My father sat at the head of the long mahogany table, flanked by Julian and a team of corporate lawyers I had never seen before. The air was thick with the scent of expensive cologne and unspoken betrayal. I took my seat at the far end of the table, purposely playing the role of the nervous, confused daughter to perfection. My father didn't waste any time with pleasantries. He slid a thick stack of legal documents across the polished wood toward me. "Sign the papers, Emily," my father said, his voice cold and devoid of any parental warmth. He went on to explain with theatrical disappointment that the flaw in my recent management reports had severely compromised the company's financial standing. They claimed they were forcing me out to protect the family legacy from my alleged incompetence. Julian couldn't hide his smug satisfaction, leaning back in his chair and watching me like a predator cornering its prey. The lawyers explained that by signing these releases, I was voluntarily relinquishing my corporate titles, my shares, and any legal claims to the family estate. What they completely failed to realize was that I had already had my legal team review these exact drafts days before. By signing these specific documents, I was letting them formally take full, exclusive ownership of the subsidiary entities where they had secretly dumped the bad debts and fraudulent offshore transactions. They believed they were legally pinning the blame on me while stripping me of my wealth. In reality, they were signing their own names as the sole responsible parties for the massive fraud. With trembling fingers, a final touch to keep up the act, I picked up the pen and signed my name on the dotted line. My father and Julian permanently smiled, convinced they had won. The rain was relentless as I drove away from the only home I had ever known, the headlights of my modest sedan cutting through the thick, gray fog. The image of my father laughing on the porch, flanked by Julian's smug grin, burned in my mind. They truly believed they had shattered me. They thought that by throwing my bags into the mud and locking the iron gates of the estate, they had won the ultimate game of power. But as the wipers beat a steady rhythm against the windshield, the initial sting of their betrayal dissolved completely, replaced by a cold, sharp focus. I pulled into the parking lot of a quiet, unassuming motel on the edge of the city limits. The neon sign buzzed overhead, casting long shadows across the asphalt. I checked into a small, plain room, dropping my duffel bags onto the floor. To anyone looking through the window, I was just a 27-year-old woman who had lost her family, her job, and her home in a single afternoon. But appearances are entirely deceiving. I sat down at the small wooden desk, pulled my laptop from my backpack and booted it up. The screen flickered to life, illuminating the dingy room with the glow of the encrypted drives I had spent months compiling. My hands were completely steady now. The time for acting submissive, playing the victim and enduring their condescension was officially over. My dad and Julian had spent years treating me like a disposable asset, assuming I would quietly fade into the background once they took everything. They had no idea that this exact moment was the catalyst I had been waiting for. By formally evicting me and taking full control of the fraudulent corporate entities, they had legally isolated themselves. I opened the secure portal provided by my legal counsel and looked at the final confirmation button. The trap was fully set, and my dad's arrogant laughter was about to become the soundtrack to his own undoing. I opened the secure communication portal and prepared the final transmission. Every encrypted ledger, every copied hard drive, and every piece of irrefutable evidence I had meticulously gathered over the past 6 months was ready to be sent. My finger hovered over the upload button for only a second. With a single click, the complete digital roadmap of my father and Julian's corporate crimes was transmitted directly into the hands of the federal authorities. The transfer bar filled up steadily, and when it flashed green, a profound sense of relief washed over me. The quiet before the storm had officially begun. Over the next few days I stayed in my temporary apartment, watching the world move forward as if nothing had changed. The federal investigators now possessed a flawless, comprehensive guide to the entire fraudulent empire. They didn't need to spend months digging through mountains of red tape. I had already done the forensic heavy lifting for them. I had organized the shell company structures, highlighted the forged signatures, and traced the exact paths of the offshore wire transfers. The authorities were quietly building an airtight case from the shadows, verifying every single anomaly I had flagged while ensuring no loopholes remained for my family to escape through. It required an immense amount of patience to just sit back and wait. I knew that my father and Julian were likely celebrating their perceived victory, completely oblivious to the fact that the clock was ticking down on their freedom. They believed they had successfully isolated me and protected themselves. They had no idea that the federal agency was already coordinating with bank auditors and preparing the necessary paperwork to freeze every single asset they owned. As I looked out the window at the city skyline, I knew that the next time my father and stepbrother faced a legal team, it wouldn't be in our corporate boardroom. It would be in a federal court. 2 weeks after they threw me out, Julian and my father decided to host a massive, no-expense-spared celebration at the family estate. Through the public social media accounts of their high society friends, I watched the entire event unfold in real time from the quiet comfort of my new apartment. The grand foyer, the exact spot where my father had stood laughing as my bags were thrown into the mud, was now filled with ice sculptures, catering staff, and the city's corporate elite. They were explicitly throwing this party to celebrate what they called streamlining operations, which was just their public polished code word for finally getting rid of me. In the videos, Julian looked entirely in his element, holding a glass of expensive champagne and loudly bragging to a group of investors about how he had single-handedly restructured our commercial real estate portfolio for maximum profitability. My father stood right beside him, beaming with pride, his arm draped around his golden child's shoulders. They were soaked in the illusion of absolute victory, completely convinced that their troubles were over and that their grand plan had executed flawlessly. They truly believed they had successfully insulated themselves from their mountain of fraudulent debts by pinning the blame on an exiled daughter. I sat back on my couch, scrolling through the photos of them smiling, clinking glasses, and soaking in the unearned praise of their peers. Anyone else in my position might have felt a wave of bitterness or intense anger watching the people who ruined them celebrate so publicly. but I felt absolutely nothing but a cold, calm anticipation. Their massive egos had blinded them so completely that they couldn't see the glaring warning signs right in front of them. They had no idea that every single guest they invited, every investor they lied to that night, and every luxury asset they flaunted was simply being added to a running federal profile. The illusion of their victory was dazzling, but it was also incredibly temporary. They were standing at the absolute peak of their fake empire, completely unaware that the ground beneath their feet had already been entirely hollowed out. The morning the illusion shattered was completely ordinary until the first black SUVs pulled into the circular driveway of the estate. I wasn't there to see it in person, but the frantic text messages from former coworkers and neighbors painted a vivid, chaotic picture. It was just past 7 in the morning when federal agents, carrying search warrants, entered both the family mansion and our corporate headquarters simultaneously. The grand stone porch where my father had stood laughing just weeks prior was suddenly crowded with law enforcement officers securing the perimeter. Inside the corporate offices, the panic was absolute. According to the messages flooding my phone, Julian was cornered in his vice president's suite before he even had a chance to log into his computer. The agents moved with practiced military precision, immediately ordering the staff away from their desks and shutting down the network servers. Every single corporate laptop, hard drive, and financial filing cabinet was systematically tagged and seized as evidence. The shell companies they thought were hidden behind layers of digital encryption were exposed in an instant, their primary servers seized directly from the IT department. At the mansion, my father was reportedly forced to stand in his silk robe as agents systematically moved through his private study, packing boxes full of hidden ledgers and personal tax records. The keys to the luxury vehicles parked in the driveway were confiscated, and by noon formal notices were slapped onto the front doors, indicating that all family bank accounts, corporate investments and real estate assets had been officially frozen by a federal court order. The fake empire they had built on a foundation of greed and deception collapsed in a matter of hours, exactly as the forensic roadmap had predicted. My phone rang just after 3 in the afternoon, the screen flashing with my father's name. I let it ring for a few seconds, listening to the vibration echo through my quiet apartment, before I finally slid the bar to answer. The voice that came through the speaker was completely unrecognizable. The booming, arrogant laughter that had echoed across the estate driveway weeks ago was gone, replaced by a frantic, high-pitched stammer that dripped with sheer desperation. "Emily, thank God you picked up," he gasped, his breath ragged. "Everything is falling apart down here. The office, the house. Federal agents are everywhere. They've frozen all the bank accounts and seized the servers. It's some massive administrative mix-up with the subsidiary companies. You need to come down to the corporate headquarters right now and explain the digital ledger migration to these auditors. You're the only one who knows the password structures and the file paths." He was still talking down to me, still completely assuming that I was just the clueless, obedient daughter who would drop everything to clean up his corporate mess. He truly believed I had no idea what was actually happening. I sat back in my chair, looking out at the city skyline, my voice entirely flat and calm as I cut him off mid-sentence. "I won't be coming down, Dad," I said quietly. A heavy, stunned silence stretched across the line for a beat before he spoke again, his tone shifting from desperation to confusion. "What do you mean you won't be coming? Emily, you don't understand the gravity of this situation. If we don't fix this paperwork immediately, Julian and I could lose everything." "I understand the situation perfectly," I replied, my voice steady as steel. "In fact, I understand it much better than you do. Those federal investigators didn't find those offshore ledgers by accident, Dad. They didn't just stumble across the forged investor signatures or Julian's shell companies. I gave them the complete digital roadmap 6 months ago. Every single document they are using to seize your assets right now came directly from my personal drive." I could hear his sharp intake of breath on the other end of the line, the sudden, staggering realization hitting him like a physical blow. The powerful, untouchable businessman was suddenly completely speechless. For the first time in 27 years, my father had absolutely nothing to say to me. "You told me I was homeless," I added softly right before I ended the call. "Now you need to worry about where you're going to live." The legal fallout was swift, devastating, and entirely absolute. Within 48 hours of the synchronized raids, federal prosecutors unsealed a massive multi-count indictment against my father and Julian. The The charges listed on the official court documents read like a masterclass in white-collar crime: wire fraud, systemic tax evasion, conspiracy, and investor fraud. Because the evidence I provided was so meticulously organized and entirely irrefutable, their high-priced defense lawyers couldn't find a single loophole or technicality to exploit. Their immediate strategy shifted from trying to fight the charges to desperate damage control. As the reality of potential decades behind bars set in, the fragile illusion of family loyalty they had flaunted for years completely disintegrated. Facing the crushing weight of a federal prosecution, Julian was the very first to break. Completely terrified of prison, the golden child immediately turned on his own father, offering a full confession and handing over personal text messages to secure a plea deal for a reduced sentence. He argued that our father was the true mastermind behind the offshore accounts, attempting to shield himself by sacrificing the man who had spent a lifetime protecting and enabling his endless failures. My father, broken by the ultimate betrayal from his favorite child, had no cards left to play. With all their corporate assets completely frozen and their professional reputations utterly ruined, they were forced to watch their fake empire get dismantled piece by piece in open court. The grand narrative they had constructed to exploit the company and frame me was laid bare for the entire city to see. Every news outlet covered the sudden collapse of our local real estate dynasty, detailing how greed had driven them to ruin. They were no longer the untouchable, arrogant elite sitting in a boardroom. They were just two desperate men facing the severe consequences of their own actions. While my father and Julian were left to deal with the severe legal consequences of their actions, the federal court began the long process of sorting through the company's remaining legitimate assets. Because I had acted as the primary whistleblower and had provided the flawless forensic evidence that exposed the corruption, the court-appointed receiver quickly realized that I was the only person capable of running the legitimate side of the business. The fraudulent shell companies and bad debts were completely liquidated to pay off state fines, back taxes, and defrauded investors, but the clean commercial real estate portfolios were legally awarded back to me. The Grand Family Mansion, the very place where I had been cruelly evicted, was put up for public auction to satisfy the millions of dollars in legal penalties my father and stepbrother had accumulated. Watching that massive property sell to an outside investor felt like the final closing of a very dark chapter in my life. I didn't want the house, nor did I want the negative memories associated with it. Instead, I focused all my energy into rebuilding the core real estate business from the ground up, establishing a completely transparent, honest corporate structure where integrity actually meant something. At 27 years old, I had successfully reclaimed the legacy I had spent my entire adult life building, but this time, it was entirely on my own terms. The people in our elite social circle who had once looked down on me or whispered behind my back as I walked away down that wet driveway were now reaching out, desperate to secure business meetings with the new chief executive. I had taken a broken, corrupt empire and turned it into a highly profitable, perfectly clean operation. I was no longer the disposable daughter or the corporate shield. I was the sole owner of my future. Looking back on everything that happened, I realized that my 27th year wasn't the year I lost my family. It was the year I finally found my own strength. Today I sit in a bright, modern office overlooking the city, running a highly successful, completely clean real estate firm that answers to no one but the law and our own strict code of ethics. My father and Julian are currently serving out their federal sentences, left with nothing but the crushing weight of their choices and the cold reality of a life built entirely on deceit. They tried to build their success by exploiting others, completely unaware that the truest form of leverage isn't greed, it's integrity. I often think about that rainy afternoon on the driveway, and the sound of my father's laughter as my bags hit the wet concrete. It used to be a memory that brought a flash of anger, but now it only brings a profound sense of clarity. That moment of cruelty wasn't my ending. It was the exact catalyst I needed to step out of their shadow and claim the life I actually deserved. I stopped being a victim the moment I decided to outsmart them from the shadows, proving that competence and quiet preparation will always triumph over loud arrogance. Now that you've followed my story to the absolute end, I want to ask you a very real question. What would you have done if your own family turned on you the way mine did? Would you have stayed and fought a losing battle in their boardroom, or would you have quietly built a trap from the shadows just like I did? Drop your thoughts and the city you are watching from in the comments below. I read every single one to see how far my journey has reached. If you found this story satisfying, Make sure to hit that like button, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you never miss our next major twist. Thank you so much for watching, and remember, the best revenge is always living well.